In the United States, several stereotypes dominate the popular imagination regarding Kentucky. Horses, bourbon, fried chicken, and bluegrass. But what is the perception of Kentucky from outside of the United States? Join us for a discussion with Simon Buck, a researcher at the University of Edinburgh, as we discuss aging, music, and how a person who grew up in the United Kingdom became interested in studying Kentucky, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society, or who have contributed to the scholarly journal, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which has been published continuously since 1903. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Today's guest is Dr. Simon Buck, who earned a PhD in history from Northumbria University. His dissertation was entitled The Aged South, Old Age and Roots Music in the U.S. South, 1900 to 1945. Dr. Buck is currently a researcher at the University of Edinburgh and has already signed a book contract for the publication of his first book. He has received research grants from a variety of institutions, including the Lewis Round Wilson Library at UNC and the Royal Historical Society. At KHS, he spent his time looking at the social, cultural, political, and medicinal history of old age and aging in modern Kentucky. So welcome. I'm here today with Simon Buck. I want to go ahead and just let him introduce himself, explain a little bit about his research, sort of what he's doing here at the Kentucky Historical Society. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Thanks very much. So I did a PhD in history at Northumbria University in the United Kingdom. I currently work at the University of Edinburgh. Perhaps we can come back to that later. So my research interest is primarily in the relationship between old age and aging and music in the US South, and I'm currently writing a book for the University of Illinois Press. But the research I'm doing here is sort of a progression from that, going beyond just musical cultures. And by that, I mean kind of elderly women that sing ballads, to old fiddlers and fiddlers contests, and all of these kinds of phenomena that you find in places like Kentucky and further south. But moving a bit beyond that to look at the social and cultural and even spiritual religious history of old age and aging, and that relationship between age and place, and looking particularly in this case at Kentucky. Was it different to be old in Kentucky historically?
Which kind of leads to one of my questions, is how did you get interested in Kentucky in particular? Because it does seem, I don't know, is it an outlier in terms of other states, or is there a reason you just honed in on Kentucky?
So it's a very good question. In terms of the initial reason was because although Kentucky has a very complicated relationship as a southern, non-southern place, in the musical context, it's a very southern place in the way it's understood. So that's kind of what initially drew me to it. I just kept being drawn to various kind of Kentuckian examples. But as I started digging into it, there is potentially some special kind of relationship. To take one example, Social Security and pensions. So prior to the Social Security Act in 1935, there were very few states nationally that had any kind of form of state pension system. There were no southern states, and Kentucky was the only one this kind of far towards the south that did, 1926. But even then, it wasn't exactly like it was a utopia for older people. It was very inaccessible and very hard to get. And so there's a strange kind of political context there as well. Another relationship is just the Confederate veteran presence in Kentucky, and that kind of culture was really strong. And as a result, you get interesting ideas about aging, sort of mixing with ideas of being a Confederate veteran at that time.
To kind of build on that.
Yeah.
As someone from the UK, is there sort of a process where you're like, oh, I want to study United States, specifically Kentucky? Is there sort of a moment you sort of realized this is what I want to do, or is there something that just drew you?
it's an interesting question. I think going back to when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I was very interested in country music and the early history of country music. So my previous trip, this is my second trip to Kentucky, my previous trip was to Berea College, where they have a lot of radio archives, early barn dance radio. And I just loved the place. I mean, it's very hard to explain as an outsider what it is that you're drawn to about Kentucky. Partly it's the natural landscape. It's just really, really beautiful. I love to hike. I love to walk. So that kind of thing's really, really nice. And there is, I don't know, there's a certain flavour. Although I have to say, speaking as a vegetarian, it's not the greatest place in the world for me.
No, if it's not fried,
it's not exactly, yeah. So that's definitely a big part of it. But I mean, there is, as an outsider, you do come to this kind of thing with a different perspective.
Yes.
And there are limitations to what I can understand, even just geographically, where this county is next to, and that kind of granular history of Kentucky. I do really have to rely on scholars that are much more kind of like versed in that kind of world. This is what I'm trying to understand more as I'm doing this research.
When you talk to people in the UK about it, is there any sort of surprising thing? Do they have stereotypes, or in the sense of just broader, is there familiarity with country music?
Well, for example, one of the reasons I feel this research resonates beyond the South and beyond even the US is that from an outsider's perspective, Kentucky is old.
Okay.
As in, they are aged. So when you imagine a person from Kentucky, it's often that stereotype of an older person with a wispy beard, for example.
Kind of the Kentucky Colonel.
Exactly, yeah. And that is a longer cultural history in Kentucky. Like there's Aunt Jane of Kentucky, that kind of storyteller character, and various forms of Kentucky elder. That is a big part of the culture here. Again, that the way age and place are kind of entwined.
Can you tell us a little about your current job and sort of your research and what you've been working on with that? Because I know it doesn't necessarily tie into your current project so much as sort of the book and all, but can you tell us a little bit about sort of the research you're doing right now? Because I think it's something that I found fascinating. I think our listeners will too.
Yeah, and it is, I'll get back to why it's relevant also to this work. So I'm currently employed at the University of Edinburgh as a research fellow. I'm just about to start when I come back from this trip on a larger project on the University of Edinburgh's historical connections to enslavement and British colonialism. It's a wide project with fellows working on South Asia, racial thought, and I'm working particularly on the connections to slavery, of which there were many through endowments and various other forms of connection. And this is part of a wider series of jobs I've had doing public history work. I've also done another project on the history of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, a hospital with its own connections to British colonialism. And I came to that work also from having experience doing the history of the US South and obviously the history of slavery here as well. And there is also a real age component to that kind of research, a health component, including even some stuff I was looking at this morning here. That was it was sort of relevant to the experience of enslaved people as, first of all, carers for elderly white enslavers, often hired for that purpose, but also the other way around, like what happens to an enslaved person when they get older. And there is some interesting work out there underway, including in the UK, on that experience of what it was like to grow old when you're enslaved. Yeah. So there's definitely connections across the way there.
Now, is it building on work in the United States? Because I'm familiar with a couple of, I know Virginia was the one that I'm most familiar with in terms of investigating sort of the links to the institution of slavery and all that sort of thing. Is it building on some of that, or is Britain's case sort of just different in the sense of, is the UK situation different than what University of Virginia or an institution here might be somewhat separate? Is it
Yes, so there is, and Virginia has been very involved there's a consortium of universities internationally now that are doing very similar work. It's called Universities Studying Slavery. Brown University and various other ones here were big leading forces of that 2 decades ago. The United Kingdom's perhaps been a bit slower to catch up with that research, to be perfectly honest. One of the biggest projects recently was Glasgow University, which did a whole audit of their connections and has actually gone an extra step and led a kind of reparations program working with a university in the Caribbean. So it's kind of catching up, but the project at Edinburgh is trying to be a bit more, bit different in its approach, and trying to engage with real stakeholders, community organisers in the university and in Edinburgh. So it's more than just a historical report. It's a real public engagement.
And that's an ambitious project, because to get that broad is really hard. I know for different universities they struggle with that, but to get in all the stakeholders, as well as just to trace those financial ties is...
It is hard, and obviously it's a very politically sensitive topic, as you'll be well aware in somewhere like Kentucky and beyond. And in Scotland, historically, people haven't always understood that there was a Scottish connection, because there was an assumption that the Scottish were themselves colonised people from the English. So there was an interesting dimension there of a realisation that actually Scots were heavily involved in enslavement and colonialism.
Well, I think it's also important because for our listeners with the Kentucky Historical Society, it's the importance of public history, but also getting those stories out there. And I think that's kind of the cool thing. It's not like you're just doing a topic and it's very narrow and you're just, in there doing it, but it's going to reach a lot of people once you sort of get it out there.
I think
challenging.
I think a work of a historian is to communicate things to the public, and if you're just speaking in your papers and your articles, which is obviously good and peer reviewed and those kind of things, there is a limitation to that. And you do need to be able to go further. And
I think that's the advantage of these public history projects, though, is sort of getting historians to kind of come out of their shell a little bit more.
Yeah,
even with stuff like podcasts, it's to get the word out there about different projects, but it's still the challenge. To switch gears a little bit. What are you looking forward the most about being in Kentucky or on this trip? Or do you have any sort of sights to see apart from the archives?
Well, my time's limited. And sadly, this time I don't get last time I went camping out near Tiberia, and I'm pretty sure a bear ate my lunch. So I don't think I'll be having that exciting experience again. Sadly, we don't have any bears near where I live. But I'm a big fan of the local liquor, of course. I live in Scotland, so I'm a Scotchman by nature, I suppose. So I'm enjoying bourbon, of course, where I can, and actually beer. There's a lot of interesting craft ale going on. I was in Louisville recently, and I sampled quite a lot. So I will be having a drink. Is my short answer.
You've got a good state for that.
Exactly.
We always joke when you're doing research in the U.S., just figuring out what locations you're going to, and figuring out, okay, what's here? What can I do in Massachusetts, or what can I do? And I think that's the cool thing about Kentucky. There's a lot here, even if
there really is.
As you feel like it's kind of rural and spread out, it's like, you can do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and obviously I'm a museum gallery geek, so I've already done quite a bit of that kind of stuff where I can. But I'm welcome for recommendations as well.
We definitely will have some for you for that. We try to keep our fellows within a network, so we'll definitely be in contact again, and we do try to spread the word when your book comes out, which I know it can take a little while, and that process is its own process, but it's fun to see sort of at this stage and getting it out there and slowly working on it. We're always excited about the new research being done in Kentucky, so it's exciting to have you here with us.
Totally agreed, yeah.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Clearly, Kentucky is far more interesting than the stereotypes that often define it. Kentucky's cuisine, music, and culture have influenced people from around the world and have led researchers to the Kentucky Historical Society to help them understand the rich history of the state. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Simon Buck, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, The Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.